The NTSB preliminary report is out on the tragic loss of the fuel freighter DC-4 aircraft in Fairbanks, Alaska back in 23 April. Though there's not a lot of new information in this preliminary report, it does verify a couple of things that we saw in the video, the surveillance video of the crash. Let's check it out. Remember, this is a fuel freighter DC-4 used to haul fuel out to the remote villages in Alaska, and this report verifies that they were in fact full of fuel, but it was not a cargo fire. The accident occurred on 23 April at 10:03 local time. The aircraft was a C54-D, that's the military equivalent of a DC-4 civilian aircraft. Weather was good, VFR with 10 miles plus visibility. Two crew members on board the aircraft fatally injured. The aircraft was operating under FAR Part 91. The accident airplane, owned and operated by Alaska Air Fuel, Inc., was transporting 3,400 gallons of unleaded fuel and two 100-gallon propane tanks. Now, these fuel tanks this fuel is transported in the fuselage of the aircraft using generally KC-135 tanker fuel cells in the back of the aircraft in the fuselage. The airplane departed from the Fairbanks International Airport at about 9:55 Alaska Daylight Time with the destination of Kobuk, Alaska. Shortly after takeoff, an eyewitness reported seeing the airplane flying to the west with the far left number 1 engine not running. What the report doesn't specify at this time was the propeller feathered. It's critical on these older prop aircraft when you have an engine failure to get the propeller feathered. We have yet to determine if that's the case. The witness also noticed a small white plume of smoke coming from the engine. The witness reported that the airplane began a turn to the south, to the left, at which point he noticed the engine was on fire. Recovered surveillance video shows white smoke behind the number 1 engine, followed by flames. The video also revealed that seconds later, a bright white explosion is seen just behind the number 1 engine, followed by fragments of the airplane wreckage falling to the ground. And that's illustrated in these still shots from the surveillance video. The airplane then begins an uncontrolled descent left turn into terrain. The number 1 engine separated from the wing about 100 feet above the ground and eventually came to rest in the frozen Tanana River. A preliminary review of the archived voice communication information from the FAA revealed that shortly after departure from Fairbanks at 1,000 feet above the ground, the pilot contacted the departure air traffic ATC specialist on duty, stating that there was a fire on board the aircraft and they needed to return to the airport. The aircraft was equipped with ADSB data, providing the aircraft position. And according to the ADSB data, after the airplane departed Fairbanks, it initially proceeded southwest and then it turned westbound. The airplane then began a left turn back to Fairbanks. The ADSB data eventually stopped near where the witness observed the accident airplane impacted the terrain. The accident airplane was also equipped with spider tracks. Now, I've never heard of spider tracks before. Spider tracks enables real-time flight tracking, automated flight watch, two-way communication, and flight data monitoring for the aircraft. The operator's archived spider tracks data has been collected for further analysis, so they will have some data about this accident. Remember, this is only a preliminary report, just preliminary information that they know is factually true at this time. A large post-crash fire ensued, which incinerated much of the airplane's structure. See figure 2 right there. That's because of all the fuel on board the aircraft once they impacted the terrain. The number 1 engine was recovered and a detailed engine examination is pending. So if we look at some old C-54 flight manuals, the accident aircraft was probably not set up in this configuration, but typically you have tank-to-engine fuel feed, a fuel tank for each engine. But the C-54 in military configuration also had a fuselage fuel tank system. In these freighter aircraft, I'm sure that these fuselage fuel tank systems have been removed from these freighters because that's where they need to put the fuel that they're tankering out to the villages. So it's more than likely that auxiliary fuel tanks were added to this design, and they'll be able to figure this out pretty quickly in the investigation. An auxiliary fuel tank system would look more like this, with additional auxiliary fuel tanks mounted in the wing of the aircraft. The C-54 is powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R2000 engines that are operating on high-octane aviation fuel, usually 100-130 octane fuel. In the event of an engine fire, it's imperative that you get that engine shut down very quickly and feathered. Each engine is equipped with a fire extinguishing system. And here's out of an old C-54 manual, and these manuals may have very well been revised by the operator. The CO2 fire extinguisher system warning lights and operating handles are mounted in a row under the cowl of the top of the main instrument panel. When one of the fire warning lights goes on, pull the selector valve for that light and then pull either or both bottle fire handles as desired. So there's 2 extinguisher bottles that you're going to feed into the engine that's on fire. The selector valve must always be operated before the bottles are opened. Once a bottle valve has been opened, the discharge of the bottle cannot be stopped. In bringing an engine section fire under control, the following should be kept in mind. Prompt action in cutting off the fuel supply to the affected engine and operating the fire extinguisher system will aid in reducing the damage. Operating an engine extinguisher selector valve also shuts off, and this is pretty common to most complex aircraft, fuel, oil, and hydraulic fluid supply at the corresponding engine's firewall. So you got to get all those systems shut down. Now it's imperative that the prop gets feathered into the wind so that the rotation of the engine stops, so that you stop windmilling the engine, because as it says here, number 2, stop rotation of the affected engine immediately by feathering the propeller, pulling that prop into the wind to prevent fuel and oil from being fed into the blaze. Immediately after noticing an engine fire, proceed as follows. Pull the fire extinguisher selector valve for that engine, move the mixture control to idle cutoff, feather the propeller and turn the ignition switch for that engine off, close the cowl flaps, and pull the fire extinguisher cylinder valve handle hard. Now, sometimes these engine fires do escape beyond the firewall, and in my research here, I found this very interesting ground accident of this C-54 in Alaska from back in 2004. And again, it was another fuel freighter aircraft, and all this happened on the ground. The crew of the 4-engine airplane started its engines for a positioning flight from a remote mining strip. Following the startup of the engines, an explosion occurred in the left wing area aft of the number 1 engine firewall and number 1 auxiliary fuel tank. The airplane was parked next to the mine's fuel storage tank, and the pilot added power on the remaining engines to move away from the storage tank. And within seconds of beginning to move, the number 1 engine fell off of the burning wing, just like what we saw here in the Fairbanks crash, but they were in the air. Followed by a separation and aft folding of the outboard end of the left wing. The outboard end of the wing, however, was still attached via control cables, so the pilot taxied the airplane another 200 feet, dragging the partially burning left wing segment to a pond of water, and then shut down the remaining engines. The crew evacuated with no injuries. Just an amazing story. Then when they went to inspect what went wrong with this, they figured out the fuel system on this aircraft. The airplane's left wing power plant and fuel system consisted of number 1 and number 2 engines. Each engine is separated from the wing by the firewall, and within the wing, from outboard to inboard, the fuel system consists of the number 1 fuel tank, the left wing auxiliary fuel tank, and the number 2 fuel tank. So 3 fuel tanks in each wing. Each wet wing fuel tank contains a submerged electrical boost pump, sump drain valves, and fuel quantity transmitters. Then they went on to inspect all the fuel pumps and the electrical system to see if the fire was started by the fuel pumps, but apparently in this case it was not, and they were not quite sure what the cause of this fire was after they investigated it. Regarding the NTSB data, where the aircraft got up to, about 1,000 feet above the ground, they started their right-hand turn towards their destination and then made a left-hand turn to get back to the airport. Some folks are criticizing the crew for turning into the dead engine, but It's the quickest way back to the airport, and it gets them back over the frozen lake bed that they could have attempted a forced landing on. However, the aircraft did not stall, as has been reported. This was a structural failure of the left wing of the aircraft following the explosion. And with all that weight of all that tankered fuel on board, there is little hope for recovering the aircraft. Again, here's another look at what these freighter fuel tanks look like inside the fuselage of the C-54, old KC-135 tanker tanks. This would be normally the location of fuselage tanks in the long-range version of the C-54. And there's a couple of great older videos showing the demanding work that these crew members are doing in Alaska, a vital resource keeping these villages fueled up, operating in and out of these short dirt strips in the mountains, with dealing with the inclement weather. Here's a view of the fuel farm where the fuel is transferred off of the C-54 and into their fuel tanks for the village. Here's a short clip of a C-54 departure from one of these remote airstrips, showing just how little margin of error there are in these operations. Just clearing the tops of the trees. Then proceeding out to lower terrain, off to the right, downstream. The full ATC audio and security camera footage of the crash can be seen on this video, the first video I did on the series on this crash. As we get more information and a public docket and a final report, we'll keep you posted. That may take upwards of a year to 2 years. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.